Tonight we're thrilled to have Sister Simone Campbell with us with the universal call to holiness through social justice. Just so that you have a few ideas about Sister, know her background. She was born in Santa Monica, California. I'm not going to tell them the year. I'm discreet. In the Dark Ages. She is of a small religious community that was originally found in Hungary, the Sisters of the Social Service, and they are a community of sisters who are rooted in the Benedictine tradition, and they work for social justice and social service from the very beginning. That was their founding, and that was their theme. She graduated Mount St. Mary's College in California, and ultimately she received law degree from the University of California at Davis School of Law. She was the editor of their law review, and she has founded the Community Law Center in Oakland, California, and she was their attorney. So for all of our legal beagles, and we have those accordingly, she'll be able to help you out. She also at one point ran as their Director General the religious community that she was part of. And now she is Executive Director of a group called Network that deals with activism when it comes to social justice through the Catholic tradition. And she is quite famous, obviously. Her big time, sister, I think, was at the Democratic Convention, where she spoke at the Democratic Convention, and she wowed them. If she's a little tired, you'll have to excuse her. Around this time last night, you were in San Francisco, and she took the red eye to Washington this morning so that she could go before the Senate committee dealing with the minimum wage. So she testified on behalf of raising the minimum wage. She's been before... I think we had something to be said there, So, and then she is quite famous. She's going to, in April of this year, her autobiography is going to come out called Nuns on the Bus. And she received a lot of notoriety, taking a group of sisters around the country on a bus, promoting social justice in certain areas and causing certain people to have difficulty as a consequence. She is absolutely, those of you who had dinner with her tonight know how absolutely delightful she is. I just had 20 minutes in the car bringing her over, and all I can say is wowzer, wowzer, wowzer. Really. And the bigger question is, she's not leaving tomorrow, whether she realizes it or not, because what time was your flight tomorrow morning? 9:15, you was there. Right now, it's still on time. Right, we don't know what's going to be. We don't know about tomorrow morning. Without further ado, without any more foolishness, I want Sister Simone Campbell.
What a dear introduction. That was great. Thank you. It is pretty amazing. I mean, sometimes when I hear my life recited like that, it's like, join the convent, lead a quiet life. That's all there is. I highly recommend it, actually, but it's kind of surprising. And I think one of the things that, in light of the theme, the quest for the holy, that's so important to recognize about this notoriety is that the reason, I just want to tell you a little bit about why we got this notoriety. And it started with the Affordable Care Act, because I wrote what's called the Nuns Letter for the Affordable Care Act, and 59 leaders of Catholic sisters community signed it, because the sisters in their community had done health care for years and knew the needs of our people. And they also knew that there was no funding of abortion in the Affordable Care Act, because that's what it said. And so they were in line with supporting the passage of the bill. But as you may recall, the Catholic Health Association, and it's Rosie, Yeah, Sister Carol Keehan, who's my heroine, came out in favor of the bill. Then what happened was I wanted to support Sister Carol, so I think, oh, well, we could write a support letter. That'd be good. But while our letter was out being circulated, our bishops' conference, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, came out opposing the bill. And this is the problem. Their staff told the bishops that there was federal funding of abortion in the Affordable Care Act. Now, my astute political analysis was liar, liar, pants on fire, but it didn't get us too far. But that was their position. 2 federal courts have now found as a matter of law that they were wrong. There is no federal funding of abortion in the Affordable Care Act. So finally, the bishop's staff had to, about a year ago, had to change their website from saying, yes, there's federal funding of abortion. You know what they changed it to? They changed it to, we fear that there's federal funding of abortion. Well, I say, like Jesus says, fear not, get over it, it's all right. But it really was because of the politics of the Affordable Care Act that we upset a few bishops. And one of the sisters who signed our letter said, oh, Simone, don't worry about it. What happened was the girls played the boys, and for once the girls won. And the boys are upset. But it was that then that resulted 2 years after that. That was in March of 2010. In April of 2012, April 14th, our organization, Network, had our 40th anniversary party. It was a great party. We were in D.C., we were at Trinity University, and it was really exciting. But you know what the big question was? How do we let people know about our mission? How do we open up and let people know we've been working on Capitol Hill for 40 years? How do we create this moment together and have a bigger impact? So we had little ideas. We were going to get a Google ad because we couldn't afford a print ad. And we were going to, have a member get a member. But you have to be very careful what you pray for, because 4 days later, on April 18th, the Vatican answered our prayer. The Vatican censured the Leadership Conference of Women Religious and named our little organization with 9 full-time staff as being a bad influence on the Catholic sisters in the United States. We made the Vatican nervous? That was pretty surprising. But what happened very quickly for me was, and this is really the key in the quest for holiness, I think, is that I got tired of answering press questions about being a sister. I mean, we're not about ourselves. It's just not us. How did we use this moment for mission? And what came to me was that, remember the story of the Samaritan woman at the well? Remember that? And Jesus is in Samaria. Remember that? He is not in Israel. He's in a foreign land. He is a Jew, and Jews didn't talk to Samaritans. Men certainly didn't talk to women. So here he is in Samaria, in a strange land, at the well, in the middle of the day. He not only talks to this woman, but he asks her for help. And what that meant to me in this context was to ask our secular friends for help. And in a city where everyone wants to claim credit for anything that works, no one remembers who first said road trip at our May 14th meeting. But as a result of an hour-and-a-half meeting, we were going on the road, we were pushing back against the Ryan budget, and lifting up the works of Catholic sisters. It was like lightning striking. It was like Pentecost. It was an amazing, amazing experience. But I think in light of this theme of the quest for holiness, what's so important to know is that while we can do the things for justice, we always have to keep an eye on where are our roots. What matters? What is the deepest peace that nourishes us? And sometimes some of us who are more of the I would say some of us who are more of an activist persuasion, like myself, have a tendency to get just into doing the things, and we can forget to keep an eye on the roots. So for, 30 years now, I've had a meditation practice that I try to do every day. On the good days, it's an hour, and then some days it's only a half hour. Probably those are the days it should be an hour and a half instead of a half hour. But, I feel pressed. But trying to be faithful to a prayer practice, and that the importance of a prayer practice is not so much that I tell God how to fix the world. It's rather that I open to God's work in and among us. Where are we being called? What do we need to say? How are we being faithful? And it is that reality that I wanted to share a little bit about, because I think my retreat just before the Vatican censure was really an important piece for me, and it might apply to you too. My retreat director, who was a Redemptorist priest and a Zen Roshi, it was so annoying. Sometimes retreats are annoying because they push you. And Pat, this Redemptorist priest, usually was not very pushy, but this time he was really pushing. And he pushed me to radically accept everyone that I deal with in D.C. Well, hey, I have a limit. And what I realized as Pat pushed me was I actually have a mental list that I refer to as my mistake of God list. And on that mistake of God list, there are some kind of prominent folk. And Pat was pushing me to say, no, Simone, Jesus in the Gospels is all about radically accepting everyone. Well, that's really, couldn't we pick somebody else to follow? That would be a nice idea. But what happened for me was to realize that the call to do this work in holiness is not about how I was treating it before, was sort of like going to war. Taking sides, they are the enemy. No. We cannot have an enemy in this. I need to keep my heart soft towards everyone. So today I'm testifying in front of the Senate Help Committee, and there are some very odd senators who have some very odd ideas. Senator Roberts from Kansas. He has the idea on minimum wage. There should be no minimum wage because what we ought to do is just give all the money to the people at the top and they'll do what's right. So, I'm not even sure he really thought of trickle down, but it was hoarded up as near as I could tell. And I was working really hard to stay in relationship with him and not write him off. Because even though we disagree on policy, the challenge of this working for justice is to make sure that we always have a connection with the person, even if we disagree. That is hugely challenging. So I was on this retreat for 8 days, praise God. And so finally at the end of the 4th day, I got to this holy place. I was so excited. I was sort of feeling holy. And at that holy place, I could care about Paul Ryan. I could care about John Boehner. I could care about Mitch McConnell, who I have to confess, a guy made without lips. It's just wrong. It's just wrong. So, but coming to this point of caring about them changed my heart and attitude towards them and how I could work for justice, because it sees their dignity too. So I'm all excited. I'm feeling a little holy. I go into Pat and I say, oh, this is lovely, thinking I'm going to have 4 more days of retreat to feel holy. Once in my life, I'll feel holy. This is perfect. And then Pat says, all right, that's nice. He wasn't terribly interested. And he says, all right, now add in fighting. Fighting? I just got over fighting. What are you talking about? Add in fighting? What do you mean? And where it took a while, it took the next 3 days of retreat to figure this out. But what I came to realize is that in the quest for justice, the call to holiness is about holding a heart for everyone and fighting for those who are left out of our care, at the margins, those who struggle at the margins, which is very different than fighting against certain people. You got the distinction? So that in fighting for people, then we can come together around it. I don't leave people out. Join me in fighting for what they need. Does that make sense? Sort of? Let me give you an example. I have an amazing life. I'll just be real clear about that. It surprises me all the time. So 2 weeks ago, I was at the White House. I was just hanging out at the White House. And President Obama was going to sign the executive order to raise minimum wage with the government contractors. And I'm sitting in the second row with a young woman who's 24, Robin, in this beautiful blue dress. She looked very nice. She was so excited. She lives in Virginia. She'd walked by the White House a lot. She'd never been in the White House. And this gorgeous blue dress. She looked just stunning. And she tells me she works full-time for minimum wage at a national clothing, a chain of clothing stores. She makes gross $15,000 a year. She nets about $12,000 a year. She's 24. She's been there 2 years. And she got this dress on sale. She paid $20.43 for the dress, and didn't it look good? It did. She was just stunning. And she was so excited. She was just bubbling over. And then she said to me, you know, you wouldn't know by looking at me that I have to live in a homeless shelter because I can't afford rent. I don't make enough money to pay rent. I thought, whoa. Well, hearing Robin's story, I got tempted just to slug a few people. I mean, metaphorically, just kind of go toe-to-toe and fight them. But what I've realized is if we are going to do this from a faith perspective, I need to stand with Robin and fight together for her need, but not as adversarial, as leaving people out. The temptation is, my temptation, because we do a lot in income and wealth disparity, my temptation is to go up to the really mega wealthy, sort of play Robin Hood, grab a few sacks and take it back and hand it out. But I really think that when you read the gospel, what Jesus calls us to is to standing with each other, having hearts big enough for each other, letting our hearts be broken open by the stories of those around us, and then working together to make change. And all are invited to this place of making change. So let me give you a couple more examples. One was, who should I do? Oh, Cynthia. Cynthia, I gave the commencement address at Trinity University in January. They have a winter commencement. And I told a story of, I carry my Bible. I didn't bring my Bible in. Oh, what an idiot. Oh, well. Sorry, forgot my Bible, because I carry all these people in my Bible. And so I told the story of some of the people out of my Bible in my talk. And Cynthia came up to me and hands me her business card and says, please, put this in your Bible. Please, please put this in your Bible. I go, okay. And then she just walked off. So I put it in my Bible. A while later, no one was around me, and so she comes back and she told me that she wasn't going to come that night because they'd just gotten some really bad news. But she came because she's an adjunct faculty and some of her students were graduating. As an adjunct faculty, she doesn't have any benefits. She just gets paid per class that she teaches. And her husband runs a small business. They had never been able to afford health insurance for themselves and their two girls, their two young'uns. I think they're like 3.5 and 5. And just before Christmas, they had gone online and got on the exchange to get health care for the first time. They were excited. But on Christmas Eve, her husband was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance, and it turns out that day, this is like January 5th, they had just gotten the diagnosis that he has like a 3rd stage cancer of some kind, and the prognosis is not good. And she was terrified. What's going to happen to her and the girls? What's going to happen to him? But she was so relieved that they had health care finally, that he was going to get treatment. She didn't know how they were going to pay for the December costs, but because the Affordable Care Act says you cannot exclude people for pre-existing conditions, he's going to get care. That's huge. That's huge. I went from that, sometimes I go to weird meetings. I went from that to a meeting that was sort of a conservative and liberal faith group, and we were supposed to be talking about issues and some of the evangelicals and how we're going to work together. We're trying to work together. You'd think faiths could get along, but not the case. And this man starts talking to me about how terrible Obamacare is and how he wants to stop it and we have to repeal it and it's just wrong. And I have just talked to Cynthia. My temptation was to scratch this guy's eyes out. I mean, quite frankly. But instead, I tried to take a deep breath. I tried to think, okay, radical acceptance, radical acceptance. And I told him the story. And you know what? Telling him the story got him at least to say, well, I'd never heard anything good about Obamacare. And it made me realize yet again that when we tell the story, it can change people's hearts. If you touch the pain of the world as real, not as a theory, but touch it as real, touch Cynthia's struggle, then it changes hearts. Too often, I think, especially sometimes in illustrious academic settings, it's possible just to argue theory and kind of enjoy the debate. But then when it comes to the level of the heart and the conversion and holiness, we can miss that piece of community where there's room for everyone. So I think that this quest for holiness in justice really asks the question, can we weep together about a shared concern? Doesn't mean we have to solve it the same way, but can we weep together? And if we can weep together, then aren't we Jesus touching the pain of the world? Now, in Oak Park, outside of Chicago, I met this group of Lutherans who started going to funerals for mostly young men who were killed in random gun violence on the south side of Chicago. And they started going there because one of their members of their church, her colleague was the mother of a young boy who was killed in a random thing. And they went just to be supportive to their fellow church member. But they were shocked that when they got there was a lot of ritual. The ritual T-shirts, you know about the T-shirts where the kids' pictures are on a T-shirt, their dates of death and birth and death, anything significant the kids did. And then all the kids that come to mourn sign them. And then the kids wear them around the neighborhood. But what struck these people that went from the Lutheran church is no one cried except them. And they realized in conversation with the community afterwards that the community had been through so many deaths, they could no longer cry. They were numb. They were numb to the story. So you know what these people decided to do? They decided to keep coming back and going to funerals. So someone cried because this boy's mother told them when they were crying, "Thank you so much. I'm so glad someone's crying for my son. Even I can't do that." Isn't that amazing? But that touching the pain and being able to express it bridged all kinds of differences. It bridged theoretical differences, it bridged economic differences, it bridged racial differences, it bridged just about anything you can think of. But where we meet is in that human place where our hearts are broken open. That's the challenge. So, these Lutherans, I love it. The Lutherans taught me the importance of being willing to go where there's a need, to touch the need, to weep. So, how do we do this? How do we do this? Well, Pope Francis has this amazing exhortation from November. Now, I hope he doesn't mind because I've been calling him Frank. I feel kind of affectionate towards him, you know. And Frank, in his exhortation, you heard about it, that it came out in November. It's amazing. It's fairly readable. Usually Vatican documents are cures for insomnia, but this one's actually very readable because he wrote it himself. And in it, he's got 4 points about how we build peace. And when I look at our nation and the political divide and the injustice that is going on, it feels so destructive, so demoralizing, so challenging, that I think we need to apply these peace-building strategies to our lives and to our government. So what he says, these 4 strategies, or 4 things that he says about peace-building, is that, first of all, he says, unity wins out over conflict eventually. And what our role then becomes in being faithful as a Christian is to then be faithful to the vision of unity. This goes back to my mistake of God list. Or the ones that I joke around and say I'd like to vote them off my island, you know. Unity is the beginning of peace, trusting that unity can come. The second, he says, which is really interesting to me, he says time is more important than space. Sort of sounds like Einstein or something. But what he means is that time, taking the longer view, having processes that can help us move forward, is more important than turf. Mm-hmm. Now, in our beloved church, there's been a few turf wars going on. Part of the fight between the bishops and the sisters has been the bishops would like to get their hands on some of our turf. And also that I think sometimes the bishops get threatened because the people like us and may not like them in the same way. And so they get defensive and they bring their walls up and they're protecting their space. What Pope Francis says is, it's not about protecting your turf. It's about having a process that develops unity. Isn't that interesting? It feels like Vatican II to me. It feels like it's that whole hope that we can move forward together. The third is the one that I think is really critical in the United States, and that is that reality is more important than ideas. Reality is more important than ideas. Do we have to worry about the roof coming in? Speaking of reality, that's just. Oh, okay. Okay. But reality is that story about Robin, or about Cynthia, or about the Lutheran who go to the South Side funerals. Those stories are more important than any theory we have, because we can fight about the theory. I know this with my brother. Everybody probably has a brother. You have somebody in your family that's just like, oh no, we can't have Thanksgiving dinner together, or else we're just going to, show home movies or something, and then disagree about what happened in the home movie. But what I realized with my brother is that we always fight about theoretical ideas of what Congress is doing or isn't doing, or these kinds of things. He's a firefighter, so if I ask him stories from his experience as a firefighter, we can connect. We can understand. Here's the hard part. But if we connect, then maybe I have to change too. This quest for holiness is about each of us having to change a little bit. And what I've discovered is I'm much more aware about how others ought to change than how I need to change. I'd love to give a retreat to Paul Ryan because I just know what he needs to do. He and I have this very odd relationship right now because he's talking a lot about poverty, and but he won't talk to me. I've tried to get a meeting with him. Oh no, he's still formulating his policy. He doesn't want to talk to me until it's formulated. Anyway, it's pretty annoying. Okay, so reality is more important than ideas. And then the last one is historic for a pope. And that is that every shape and size needs to be included. He says that we are not just a pie chart and each a little wedge. It's a polyhedron. We're all different shapes and we bring different things together, but we need the whole to create the sphere. And that everybody brings their part. So the question becomes, when we're trying to come together around something in the quest for justice, you have to ask, who's been left out? Who's not here at the table? Who can we also include? Today, in the midst of this very busy day, we had a meeting at Network to talk about what our election project in September and October is going to look like to support the 2014 elections. Because we're really about the 100%. Well, what we realized is that we had been doing a lot of justice work around minimum wage, immigration reform, and other things that I'm going to talk about. But the piece that we need to include if we're going to be a polyhedron that the Pope calls us to be is to include the business community, include the academic community, get everybody in to talk about the common good in their local situation. We need to be inclusive. And the glory of Pope Francis, is that he is including everyone. How wonderful to have a leader who says all are welcome and means it. A year ago, I was at the Easter prayer breakfast at the White House, and Vice President Biden, he likes me a lot. It's kind of sweet. He's a really sweet guy. But anyway, he comes up to me, and he had just returned from I don't know, what do you call it, the installation of Pope Francis? Is it an installation or ordination, coronation? Anyway, he just got the job, and they had their party. okay? And when the vice president met Pope Francis says to the vice president, Mr. Vice President, you are always welcome here in the Vatican. You are always welcome here. And Vice President Biden has been denied communion. He's been told to leave a church. He has been hurt dramatically. And so when he tells me this, he gets tears in his eyes. And so I get tears in my eyes. And then we just hug each other and sort of cried. It was so sweet. But what the Pope is leading us to understand is that when we work for justice, we have got to find a way that all can be included. That we bring people in and understand their perspective. That's the challenge. So let me give you some examples of what we're working on. We're working on minimum wage, told you that. So day before yesterday, in my very busy life, I was in Southern California, and we held a business roundtable on minimum wage, where we listened to, had conversation with a city manager, a member of the city council, the local chamber of commerce, and a doctor, a neurosurgeon. And the neurosurgeon, after we were into it about maybe 15 minutes, I asked him, well, what did he think the common good was when we come to the issues of wages? And he looks at me and he goes, I'm a Republican. What do I know about that? And I said, well, I thought he probably had some good ideas because he's a medical professional and he's in that to care for people. Well, he was a little surprised that I would follow up and that he couldn't just use the label, the theory, and I tried to push him to some experience of realities, patients he was concerned about. And so we had a very interesting conversation of trying to break that open. And then at the end, I went around and I asked each person who'd been in this conversation. I was going back to D.C., and I wondered if they had advice to give me or things that I could be mindful of from their perspective. And it was very dear, the Chamber of Commerce person and all this, we heard of the city manager but the doctor touched me the most deeply. Because you know what he said? He said, several years ago, I never would have said this. And several hours ago, I probably would have never said this out loud to you. But I'm really for a single-payer healthcare program now, which was the very progressive healthcare program that didn't get addressed in the negotiation for the Affordable Care Act. So here's this Republican doctor who felt like he couldn't participate. And then because we talked, because there was room, because everyone had a place at the table, he could begin to think in some new ways and talk in different spaces. That's what we're trying to do at Network. It's hard work. And then some days I just would rather have a fight and I'd rather be right and all those other things. So we're working on minimum wage. And today when I testified, I told the stories of minimum wage workers, Robin and Teresa, whose husband died really unexpectedly after 28 years of marriage, and she'd been a stay-at-home mom, and she's had to go back to work. And so she's doing minimum wage. She doesn't know if she's going to be able to keep the house. And all this stress. It's just really hard. But then I talked about Jason, who's a 35-year-old guy I met who has built and sold 3 companies. He's like mega rich, they tell me. That's why I was visiting with him to see if he'd donate to us. But we were talking minimum wage, and he pays all of his workers more than $10.10 an hour, even though the lowest simple skilled worker, because he thinks it's his ethical responsibility. And so in that ethical responsibility then, he is, from his perspective, is doing the right thing. But then he tells me he's getting a little peeved, I think he said, that his competitors are paying lower wages and having their workers go and use government benefits. so that they have lower costs. But then Jason realized it was his tax dollars that were going to fund his competitors. And this was annoying him. So I told that example. It was really interesting today because Senator Lamar Alexander, very conservative, he's the vice chair of the committee. He said in response to that it isn't the role of business to do the ethical thing. That it's the responsibility of government to fill in for the people that don't get enough. I was so confused because what is it to lead an ethical life if an ethical life doesn't get reflected in the business decisions that we make? So we have to do a follow-up visit with him because this is just boggling my mind. And to have a Republican say it was the government's responsibility to make sure we feed people, that isn't what they've been saying recently. So we're working on that. We're working on the implementation of the Affordable Care Act and its improvement going forward. Right now, we still have a lot of work to get people enrolled. Right now, there's still problems. But one of the things people forget or didn't know is that the Affordable Care Act was never intended to be the final bill. It was supposed to be conferenced with the House bill, and it was going to be, some of the edges were going to be smoothed out. We were going to make these compromises. It was going to be way better. But then, thanks to Massachusetts, I was in Boston a week ago, and I told them, it's all your fault. But they voted for Scott Brown, who then made that no other bill was going to get out of the Senate. So when you get mad at the Affordable Care Act, you have reason to be mad at the Affordable Care Act. It's not perfect, but it is such a dramatic step forward for so many people from what we've had before, that it's worth fighting for. We're also working on immigration reform. I really didn't bring some. Okay. It's down in my room, but that's all right. Immigration reform. I encourage you to go on our website at networklobby.org. Some of you told me that you are members. And we're doing this really great thing for Lent. We're doing immigration for Lent. And here's this idea of radical acceptance and fighting. So radical acceptance. So what we're doing is we've got this calendar and a picture of a key legislator, a member of the House, for every weekday. And then under their picture, we have their phone number. And so the idea is every day of Lent, you pray for a different legislator. And then you call them up. You call up their office and say, today was Steve Shabbat from Cincinnati. And so I was praying for Mr. Shabbat, and I called up and told his office, I just want you to know that as a member of Network today, I prayed for Mr. Shabbat that he'd have an open heart to the immigrants in our nation that are making such a huge contribution, and that I'm urging him to go talk to Speaker Boehner to bring up an immigration bill. Because the laws are broken, we need to fix them. He can do it. It's kind of fun. But it's this combination of prayer and action where you don't, sometimes I'm tempted just to slap him upside the head and tell him to get over it. But the fact is that we've got to have a heart that connects and moves them. Because if we get into that sort of fight, polarized fight, it's only going to get worse. And so trying to operate from a spiritual place which reverences the dignity of each individual, even the folks on my mistake of God list, is key. And reverencing the dignity of each individual, then we can work together to create the common good. So what happens in the end is that I've come to realize that we indeed are one body. And Paul is right in the epistle where he says, there are many members, but we all serve a different function. One of the problems is, I think, we don't see each other's functions sometimes. So I'm trying to have this Lent, trying to see that bigger picture and work to understand other people's roles. I'm not sure I understand Senator Lamar Alexander's role right now after that comment he made today. But I've come to think perhaps my role is I'm like stomach acid. I help digest food. I digest a bunch of stuff and help nourish the body. But the problem with stomach acid, you have to keep it in its place, and that too much of it can be really a bad thing. So I need to be balanced out by other points of view, by food in other ways, by other gifts and talents. And if I see myself as in need of your complementarity, then isn't that realizing the reign of God, what Jesus called us to? That together we can make a difference. Now, I do it because of faith. I'm assuming you're here because of faith. And it's a struggle because it's embodying the gospel in our daily life. I've found out that one of the places I'm called to be stomach acid, I think, and maybe you are too, but is like standing in line at the grocery store. We never talk to each other as strangers about important stuff. So what I've started to do at the grocery store is if you stand in line at the grocery store, say to the person in front of you or behind you, hey, have you thought about immigration reform? Or have you thought about raising the minimum wage? What I've discovered is people have thought about it, but we never talk about it. And so we get siloed. We get separated. If indeed we want to rediscover the fact that we are one body, we've got to talk to each other about important stuff. It's important for faith, and it's important for our democracy. It's that kind of missionary work that can build up a democracy and make a more perfect union. For me, my worry is that we all watch our siloed news source. 3 weeks ago now, I had 3 different media appearances, and they send a car for you and they take you off to the studio. So the first guy tells me, oh, yes, he likes to know the truth, so he watches Fox News. That's what he watches. I go, oh, really? Oh, that's interesting. A couple of days later, I'm off to the studios, and the guy says, yes, I like to know the truth. I watch MSNBC. That's what I do. I want to know the truth. Well, that's nice. That's good. Closer to how I think of things. And then the next guy says a couple of days later, they all said this. I want to know the truth. So I watch CNN. And then I realized I want to know the truth, so I watch PBS. But the challenge is we're all siloed, and we don't communicate across differences. So my hunch is, as a pilgrim people, as one body, one of the places we're challenged is to find a way to communicate our hearts across big divides. That's what Jesus did. When you look at Jesus in the gospel, Jesus was forever going and touching a problem. Lepers were a problem. Lepers were alienated. They were sort of like people living in poverty that we want to stigmatize. What did he do? He goes and touches them. The blind people, he heals them. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, the righteous, he scolds them. But he engages. And so I think this path to holiness in our time, in our place, is really the struggle to engage a society where we're encouraged to be couch potatoes. We, the people, need to engage for the sake of our souls, for the sake of our communities, for the sake of our nation. And I do it because of faith, but I also think we need to do it because of the Constitution. In a pluralistic society, I can't expect other people to share my faith. But what I can expect is that we all meet in the Constitution so that we, the people of the United States, can form a more perfect union and establish justice. That's what we're talking about. So this Lent, maybe you could think about it. Try grocery store missionary work. Go on our website, pray for your congressperson, and then make a call. Or even just engage whoever is the equivalent of my brother in your family and ask a story. What's your experience? What touches your heart? And in that process, that's where I think we discover community. And in the end, that's the reign of God. And for that, it's the new Easter. Thank you very much.